Hello, everyone. So welcome to everyone who is attending this online training session. So over the next hour and a bit, we'll be hearing from 6 speakers who will be discussing how to research environmental histories in library collections and online collections. So our first speakers are Sue Willits and Paul Jackson. So Sue is a senior library assistant and Paul is deputy librarian at the combined library of the Institute of Classical Studies and the Hellenic and Roman Societies. They're going to be speaking today about resources that are available for researching environmental histories in the classical world. We'll then be hearing from Argula Rublak, who is academic librarian for history at Senate House Library. She'll be speaking about the research process for Senate House Library's current exhibition, Weather Notes, and how to find resources on the weather and environment in a research library collection. Michael Townsend is one of the collection librarians at the IHR Library, and they'll be speaking about how to use the library's collections to research the 1927 Mississippi flood. And then afterwards, we'll hear from John Levin, who is editor for British History Online, and they'll be talking about what BHO is, how to use it for studying and researching environmental history, and how to uncover environmental histories in political and state-made documents. And I'm Jenny Lelkesh-Rugel, and I'm one of the editors of the Bibliography of British and Irish History, and I'll be talking about how you can use the bibliography to research environmental histories. There is going to be time at the end for a short Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments during any of the presentations, if you just put them in the chat, and then we'll then go through those during the Q&A. And just to be aware that the session is being recorded, so you should all be on mute, but just to say that is there, and also if you don't want to appear in the recording, just to make sure that your cameras are off. So without further ado, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Sue and Paul for the first session of today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Jackson, the Deputy Librarian at the Combined Library of the Institute of Classical Studies and the Hellenic and Roman Libraries, and I'll be dealing with print material on the classical world and the environment. And about halfway through, I'll hand over to Sue Willits, who is our online expert. Now, in case you haven't come across our library, we're about 140 years old now. We have about 150,000 books and periodical volumes on the classics. We're 2 libraries in one. The Institute of Classical Studies is a postgraduate institute of the University of London and also part of the School of Advanced Study. Membership of the Institute of Classical Studies is open to anyone who's a postgraduate or an academic, and that gives free access to the whole of the library. If you wish to be able to borrow, you'd need to join the Hellenic and Roman, or the Hellenic Society or the Roman Society, and they make up HAL. About between 2/3 and 3/4 of the library's collection is borrowable. So that's by annual subscription, and there's a student subscription, which currently is rather less than half the full subscription for a year. So please come along and do that if you're interested. There's more information on our webpage and details on the last slide, and also an email address should you wish to email us direct with any questions. We've taken a broad brush approach to the subject with an outline of resources and possible research paths, starting with the next slide, please. The HAL and ICS library catalogue. This is common to the whole of the School of Advanced Study and also the Senate House Library. On the next slide, we've got some keyword search terms, because if you put in the word, previous slide, please, hopefully, previous. Oh,
sorry,
no.
My computer's a little bit slow.
Yes, you want to be two back, I think, at this point. Back, back, going forward. Should be going back.
I'll start again.
That's right. We should be on slide 3. I hope.
There we are.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Right. If you put in the word environment, you'll find it's gone again. Never mind. Have to take our word on it. you won't find that much material. So we've supplied some suggested keywords, which will, in terms of the catalogue, appear in the title, may appear in subject headings, although the safest thing to do is to use some of these keywords and then see what subject headings appear in the catalogue records that you find. On the next screen, we've given some suggested class marks in our library collection. We actually index class marks and use them as local subject headings. So, for example, if you've got a book on the environment in Britain, it would have a class mark for environment and for Britain. So that gives you some possible ideas. If you can move on now to the next slide, please. These are the two main one-volume reference works, that in both print and online. There's the standard Oxford Classical Dictionary, last edition published in 2012, now available online and updated online. To the left is the Princeton Encyclopedia of Classical Sites. This is now quite an old book, very old book, 1976, but has a lot of useful material in, and that's now freely available online, open access. The next slide, please. We are fortunate to have a nice collection of early books. We have a good selection of mainly 17th, 19th century works on Mediterranean travel. These can include information on, as you see here, contemporary climate conditions. This is in the Ionian Islands. And on the next slide, we have a work on Aleppo, which talks about the plague there. This slide and the next slide also feature some very general books on the environment in the classical world. The right-hand one in this screen, you get the content, so you get an idea of the long-term history of the environment. On the next slide, we start dealing with natural disasters. There is a lovely catalogue of ancient earthquakes. We have, which of course, unfortunately, very appropriate at the moment, but it's always been a feature of Mediterranean history. Of course, in the classical world, our great thing is the eruption of Vesuvius in 79. So you'll find a lot on Pompeii and Herculaneum. On the next slide, you'll see an edition of Pliny. This is the Loeb Classical Library. This is an edition of Greek and Latin texts with facing English translation. The series first started in 2012 and is now fully available online, and Sue will deal with that half of it. We're very fortunate. One of our rare contemporary accounts is that of the younger Pliny, writing in 79 to the Roman historian Tacitus about the eruption of Vesuvius, which involved the death of his uncle, the naturalist Pliny the Elder. On the next slide, we've tried to demonstrate how the environment intersects with many of the collecting areas of the library. On the first item, for example, is Homer and the natural environment. In the middle, you'll see pollution and environment in ancient life and thought, which we would call philosophy. And there's also two of very many works which we would cover in archaeology and topography. Moving to the next slide, the obvious topic for us is going to be agriculture. So you'll see there's a handy concordance published by Wiley on ancient agriculture in the middle, and material on food supply, and the farming of cereals and livestock on this. And on the next slide, please. We felt we had to include at least one work by K.D. White. He was a reader of ours for all of his long life, working on Roman farming and the country. And the next slide also features natural resources, trees and timber. And there's a nice picture from our book on the Ionian Islands that we saw earlier, which has a stone looking as though it's growing through a tree. Of course, a tree growing round the stones, but the stone sits halfway in and halfway out of the tree, a very old olive tree. On the next slide, we have pictorial representations of the natural world, which is the two main source of evidence for the classical world, apart from what you dig up, is really mosaics and wall paintings and literature. The image on the right is a mosaic. Actually, it's in 4 registers. You see the 3 of them from Churchill in North Africa. North Africa, very rich in mosaics and showing farming in great detail. We also have wall paintings in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and elsewhere. There is a small amount of relevant architecture, nilometers, which, as the name would suggest, on the Nile. These were used to measure the annual inundation of that river, and also the Tower of the Winds in Athens, which measures things like, I don't believe it measures wind speed, certainly wind direction. If we now turn to the next slide, I mentioned briefly with Pliny about the Loeb Classical Library. Ancient author, it's a reasonably comprehensive collection now. Virtually everything you'd want is now available in translation. They can be read in print or searched online. And at this point, I'll hand over to Sue.
Hello, everybody. I pick up here and just add that when this series of books was created, they're small size and they were originally designed to be fit into a gentleman's coat pocket and gentlewoman's coat pocket as well. But I do like this series. The green volumes are the Greek texts and the red ones are the Latin texts. I did a quick search here and showed you that the word environment only produces 48 results. And this is extremely disappointing, but doesn't really represent the true state of things. If you're going to go on, so browsing or searching, there's 2 different ways to approach this. If you can go to the next slide, what I've done there is I've suggested that actually, rather than using environment as a word, you use all these other words: landscape, farming, crops, etc., climate, because this is in translation. And you will need to think of all the different words. I mean, even for cattle, you're going to use cattle and cows and calf. They're three different words. But what's very helpful with this series is that each author is attached to a group, a genre. So when you search, say, Varro, he writes on agriculture, what helpfully pops up at the bottom of the screen when you search is that actually there are 18 authors assigned to that category. And so it goes on. So you're going to get many. You can confine your searching to these groups. Natural history is an obvious one as well, but geography, physics, zoology, I mean, there's a huge amount to be discovered. We have free access for our members, and if anybody was thinking of becoming a member, it's very good value, because a membership of the Loeb Library is, I've just looked it up, $175 a year in the first year, and then it drops down to 75. So much better to join our library and have free access offsite as well. So it's a very useful tool. And as I say, it's in the Greek would be on one side of the page and the English on the other, and you can search in English. Moving on to the next slide, got an example here of just 2 authors. One, Colly Muller on the right, he wrote on agriculture, and he also wrote a separate book on trees. And what's interesting here, his opening words, it's very small here, but concerning the unfruitfulness of the soil. So the problems of climate change, soil erosion, these things have been with us forever, really. But you know, there it is, laid out the problems there. Very useful work. Another one I put up is Plutarch. It's very small, but Plutarch on the causes of natural phenomena, and he starts off, you know, seawater. Problem of seawater. Why does that not provide trees with nourishment? And I just put some blocks around those words, but hours of research to be done there. So plenty of work on the environment. If you can move to the next one, next slide. Moving away from that database, I'd just like to highlight that book reviews are a very good source of information. Quite often it's useful to see what other people think of a book. And there's a specialist review page, Bryn Mawr Classical Review, especially for classics. I put the link on there. And in the course of doing this research for this presentation, Paul and I were searching, we came across a book which talks about where natural phenomena such as earthquakes led to the creation of myths and cults, underground deities and places of worship. And in fact, we haven't got this book yet. We're going to order it. So it does very good reviews of new books and so on, and you can search by keywords. So that's a very good source of information. JSTOR, just mentioned in passing, most people would know about that already. And underneath there are 4 more databases, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but just to mention here that they also have book reviews. You know, it is very useful to see what people think of a book. Sometimes you can get 5, 10, 12 book reviews attached to an entry. Just move on to the next one. Right, this is perhaps my favourite thing. L'Année philologique. It's a database that's been going since 1924 in print, and it's now online. The name, people think sometimes it was all about philology and language and literature and so on, but no, it does cover science, philosophy, classical studies, generally archaeology. You can see the sort of spread there of the topics it covers, and it's a brilliant resource. We have, again, free access online for members. Just move to the next one. Next slide, next. Right, you can just use keywords. A typical way to go about this would be to put in the word environment with an asterisk, which will pick up environmental, and so on. So that's fine, and it would also search the abstract of an article or a book. So the word doesn't have to be in the title, it can be in the abstract. But what's very good about this database is that they've built in these thematic searches. There's 2 types. It looks a bit complicated here because they start off with broad categories. You click through earth science, then it goes down to geography and so on. But they also offer life science and technology, and agriculture's in there. So a bit of a crossover, really. But another way of going about it is to put in environment as your search, then up it pops environment and landscape, which seems ideal, really. Again, 700 references going back to 1924. But that's when you start to refine things. And I just put in climate just to see what would happen. Of course, you get 23 as a result, which is much more manageable. To give an example of how it looks, there's a couple of things there. Environment and Society in the Late Long Antiquity. That's a book, and there's one review attached to it. But then a more general one, Ancient Origins and Medieval Fields, in a journal, tells you the pages. I haven't put all the abstract in, there's not much room on the slide, but this is a very good resource, easy to use, and you can save the results, very easy, and one of my favorite things. Moving on to the next one. So these now are, this is a free database called Gnomon. There's a little symbol there of the sort of owl, I think, stabbing something, I don't know quite what, but that's their logo, the website underneath. They do the same sort of controlled subject headings, a bit like with our book catalogue, things are controlled. Environment, 1,387, so a huge result there. But I think the whole problem with this subject we've discovered is that the word environment has been taken all sorts of ways. The literary environment, you know, people don't use it in the sort of agricultural landscape way really. So, but the way to actually refine things here is pick something from that huge list that relates to what you're doing, and then you find out the more detailed heading underneath, and which is starts off its German heading there, nature and so on, and that brings it down to immediately to 503, much more manageable, and then you can search within that. One thing that's very great fun, really, the GNOME one actually has collected together over 2,000 YouTube clips relevant to classical studies, lectures, talks, all sorts of things, really. So they treat the YouTube as a subject heading. There's over 2,000, as I say, and then you can limit it by keyword within that. And I found this very useful talk. It's a 40-minute lecture by Edith Hall, who's quite well known in the classics world. She's also involved with theatre, so you might have come across her at the National Theatre. Homer's Iliad and environmental catastrophe. It seems right up our street, really. I'm going to look at that. So that's very good, I think. Very useful resource, and it's free. Moving on to the next one. Right, two more free ones. This one is called Zenon, and it's based in Germany, really. German Archaeological Institute is behind it. Very strong in archaeology, very easy to use, and you can refine things as you go. It gives you a great deal of help, showing you how to refine things, and you can again download the results. So a very good resource. Toxin is quite fun. This is compiled by volunteer librarians, of which I'm one, around the world, and we send in the contents of new journals. I do 6 titles, send them in as soon as they appear, because the other databases, sometimes they're a bit behind the times, they're not immediate. It's very basic. You search 1 or 2 keywords, it's a very broad selection and free and easy to use. Again, what I should say is there's no full text in here, or very rarely. It's actually just the references to books and articles. What's next? Moving on. All right, yes. So online resources, more online resources. Excuse me. What we've been doing in compiling this is actually seeing that really this is a very vibrant topic, and of course very topical, really, climate change and so on. The way to find out what's going on in the classics world is to join this Liverpool Classics mailing list. There's not enough room to explain how you do that on this page, but we've put it on our web page under library resources and so on. You subscribe, but beware, you do get between 5 and 10 posts a day, but you can set it up to only receive it once. Very, very good. Recent conference papers that have come up, ancient plants, environment, natural elements, mosaics represented, lead poisoning, an old topic, ecological grief in the ancient Mediterranean. So there's a huge amount. One I was very interested in was new approaches to the history of the plague. That as a result of looking at that, I found out, which I didn't know before, that there's a Centre for Ancient Environmental Studies at St Andrews. So that's been going for the last few years. So that's a very important resource, really, to see what work they're doing. There's future events coming up, more things about Leaf, Natural World, and the Virgil Society in America are having a conference next year. So it really is a very important topic. There's also podcasts. One very good one began 2 years ago, The Sustainable Past. Some very interesting things there. And that's all free to use, of course. And the School of Advanced Study is involved as well. They've got something called the Talk in Humanities blog, which does include archaeology. One I've just looked at is about the eruption of Pompeii. Another one about historic civilizations in general, and that was about pollution in Rome. So very interesting. Something also about the How to Academy. That's quite interesting. This is talks where you often have to pay, book launches and so on. There's a new book out by Peter Frankopan, who wrote The Silk Road. His new book is The Earth Transformed, and it's had very good reviews. We've just missed it, but it's the 1st of March. There was a talk with Sir Tony Robinson to launch the book. I think if you had to pay to go to the lecture, and you perhaps got a reduced copy of the book. But again, this is very much a topic of the moment. I'm very pleased to have found this information. Just moving to the last slide. This is our web page with a picture of a former trainee there, looking at some rare books. We've put our contact details on. We have a general contact detail there, iClass inquiries, and the web page is because you can't see the web address there, but I put it on in the middle. So any questions, send them to our contact details and look at our web page to find out more resources. And also please come along and join. I'll give you a library ticket and in you come once you've paid. Right, I'm just going to stop now and introduce the next speaker. I think we're more or less on time. Next speaker is Argula from the Senate House Library.
Hey, hello everyone. Thank you, Sue. I'm just gonna share my slides. Bear with me 1 second. Here we go. Hey, thank you for coming along to hear us talk about environmental histories. I'm Argula Rublak, and I work at Senate House Library as the academic librarian for history. One thing I've also been doing recently, though, is I've been asked to co-curate an exhibition that we currently have on at Senate House Library, which is called Weather Notes, which is part of the 1,000 Words for Weather project. So what I'm going to do today is talk you through the concept of the exhibition and also above all how we did the research for it. And just to give us a fancy title, I've called this Chasing Clouds, or How to Research the Weather in a Research Library Collection. So let's start out with an overview of Senate House Library. For those of you who are not aware of us yet, we are the central library for the University of London, but we're also one of the largest libraries in the UK that specialise in the arts, humanities and social sciences. And we're right next door to the Institute of Historical Research at Senate House, and just above the Institute of Classical Studies Library. So what we have in our library, we have a vast amount of print and electronic research collections, but we also have a lot of special collections, archives and manuscript collections. So a ton of interesting things for you to explore. So in early 2022, we were approached by the company Art Angel to host a newly commissioned sound installation called 1,000 Words for Weather. Alongside the sound installation, the library was asked to put on an accompanying exhibition to fit the theme of the installation, which would then become the Weather Notes exhibition that I just mentioned. So when we were first told about the project, it's fair to say that we thought putting together an exhibition of our library items on the theme of the weather and nature and the environment more broadly could represent quite a big challenge for us. Nature and environment had never really been an explicit focus of Senate House Library's collecting policy or collecting development. So there wasn't really a named collection to start with and no real obvious place to start searching for materials on the topic. And moreover, the weather and the environment more broadly, as Sue has already elucidated, it can be something that is present in a lot of sources. And it's an ever-present and constant part of our surroundings. We always are in touch with the weather in many ways. So arguably, everything we do is somehow produced by our environment. So at the start of the research for the exhibition, we kind of had the problem of not having an obvious place to start, but also with having a very ubiquitous theme. And this will probably be quite a familiar challenge to a lot of you who have done research into environmental history before. The ubiquity and variety of the sources that you can make use of can make this kind of research especially hard to pin down. So in this presentation, I'd just like to talk about how we went about the process of researching our exhibition with Senate House Library's own collections as a bit of a case study for how you might go about doing research into a topic like this. And I hope this is helpful in some way for researchers like you who may be in a similar situation like me and my co-curator were, standing in front of quite a vast library collection and not knowing really where to start. Okay, So first step, quite an obvious one, but we first started with a literature review. So the first thing I did is I did a bit of a scoping exercise on secondary reading with the aim to create a short bibliography of key works that I could then read on the subject. So I went to the Senate House Library catalogue, simply typed in the keywords weather and history to get me started. And whenever I saw a title that sounded relevant, I added it to a list, which I'm able to create as part of my Senate House Library account. And many library catalogues have this function, and it's worth keeping an eye out for it, because a feature like this can help you keep an overview over the reading that you've selected for yourself that you want to investigate further. Alternatively, you could also use something like a reference software for this purpose, something like Zotero, for example. And once I'd identified what I wanted to start reading, I then went to our shelves, and here I didn't only pick up the books that I already found on the catalogue, but I also took this opportunity to look at the neighbouring books surrounding the one that I had already found in the catalogue. So library classification often clustered together related topics, and looking at the neighbouring books can help you quite a lot with finding additional material that your initial catalogue search may not have surfaced yet. I then went ahead and read the books themselves, of course, but I also made sure to do a thorough scan of the bibliographies at the back to get some additional inspiration on what other works I could consult. In this case, we were doing an exhibition. The primary source sections of the bibliographies were actually especially useful because we could then go and check if our library had an edition of the works that were mentioned there. And that the primary sources section can also provide you with a lot of original material to examine, above all, re-examine from the perspective of your own chosen research topic. Alongside these steps, I also did, of course, an online search to check, above all, if other library, archive, and museum collections had already done similar exhibitions on similar themes. And this is how I stumbled across, for example, the websites of the Royal Society that had just done an exhibition on the weather in 2019, I think, sometime before the pandemic. And they did that exhibition in collaboration with the Library and Archive of the Meteorological Office. And this was a collection I hadn't really encountered before, and they had some really brilliant online exhibitions to browse through as well. So I'd recommend you have a look at those if that's of interest. Okay, another method I used to find material for the exhibition was to create word clouds. So creating lists of of words that are synonyms, narrower terms, broader terms, or related terms of your original search can really help you vastly expand your findings. So to give you a very simple example, you could use the word climate instead of weather, or you could translate the word weather into its Spanish equivalent tiempo or into any other language and see how the search results change. And if you want to go narrower, you could search for a specific weather phenomena in our case. So you could search for things like clouds, storms, lightning, and so on. The main thing that I really want to get across, as we've heard in the previous presentation, is to be quite creative and expansive about the search terms that you use. And this will open up a lot of different research possibilities for you. Another tool which was incredibly helpful to use were our catalogue subject headings. Subject headings are sets of terms that librarians apply to resources to categorize them and to enable library users to find works beyond their title, author, and publication data. So I've got an example on my slide here to the left. This is an example from our catalogue for an entry of Luke Howard's The Climate of London. The subject headings for this entry are, they're circled in red at the bottom left here, meteorology observations, meteorology England, and London in brackets England climate. In our catalogue and in most other library catalogues, these descriptions also function as hyperlinks. So if you click on one subject heading, you will be led to another set of catalogue entries that have had the same terms applied to them. And the more of these catalogue entries you check, the more subject heading sets you'll likely find for your research. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I've just given you a few examples of some of the ones that I came across while doing my research. Of course, you can also adjust these terms as you like. So you could take a heading like weather forecasting early works to 1800, and you could just take out the appendage early works to 1800 and then just perform a search on that. So again, a good source of inspiration for how to find things. The final tip, or the final step of the process that we went through for the research of the exhibition, was that we made sure to consider different types of resources that we could use that went beyond books. So I definitely would encourage you not only to look for your through your library's digital and print books and journal collections, but definitely also check if the library you're working at has things like archival collections or collections of artifacts, maybe even collections of art and a few other things. Yeah, just a few examples there. So on the left here, I've just given a few items that I found by not just looking at our book collections. So I found a letter on the very left here that was written by Charles Booth, the 19th century social reformer, to his daughter Antonia. We found a copper plate that represents an illustration of a cloud that was made by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the famous German philosopher and writer. And on the bottom right, we have a sketchbook in which a young woman called Harriet Lewin documents her travels throughout Europe in the early 20th century. So quite a nice set of items that we were able to find there. So a lot of libraries and other types of collections usually don't just contain one type of material. But just a word of caution, sometimes the other types of collections can be not quite as visible, or they're described and catalogued in a different part of the institution's infrastructure. So in our case, for example, we have a separate archival catalogue. The entries for our archival items are integrated into our library catalogue search, but there's usually a way to filter out only archival materials in the search. And sometimes there's also some advantages to using the separate archival search interface. Accessing information on how you get to those systems and different types of materials varies a lot by institution. So I definitely recommend that you don't be afraid to ask your local collection staff, just so if they can help you or point you to some resources that might be useful to you. That's really about it. And that's the final product. This is the exhibition that we've currently got on. It's open until the 25th of March, alongside the sound installation. After the 24th of March, the installation will be gone, but we'll still keep the book exhibition up until the 24th of June. So if you do want to come and visit it, you're very welcome to until the summer. Admission is during library opening hours. There's an entry charge of £5, but if you're already a library member, you're very welcome to come in free of charge. And I've given you a link to book your tickets if you're interested on this slide. And if you can't travel to London for any reason, you can still see the items in the exhibition. We've got an online gallery of all the items that is available with the link at the bottom of the slide. Thank you for listening. I hope that was somewhat useful to some of you. If you have any questions about our collections, especially the history collections or the exhibition, you're very welcome to contact me at any time. And I've also given you the general Senate House Library email address in case you want to ask any questions about the library more broadly. I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the session. So that's it from me, and I'll now hand over to Mike Townsend from the IHR Library.
Right, hi everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay. There we go. Right. Right. Okay. So good afternoon. I'm Mike Townsend, one of the collection librarians here at the Institute of Historical Research. And today I'll just give you a brief talk about the IHR Library and the resources you can find here about environmental history, as well as the results of a finding exercise I did on the Mississippi flood of 1927. And just to mention before we proceed, there are several links on the following slides, so don't worry about writing them down furiously. They will be included on a list of resources sent at the end of this session. So, just some context first about who we are and what the library collects. The Institute is just over a century old now, and during that time, the library has amassed over, I think, about 210,000 titles. The main remit of the library is to collect published primary sources, which make up the vast bulk of what you can find in our collections. Although we also actively collect published bibliographies and source guides, archive and manuscript catalogues when they're still published, some reference works, and a range of approximately, I think, about 300 history periodicals as well. Chronologically, we cover everything from the early medieval period to now, and geographically we concentrate on Western Europe and the colonial histories of the West European empires, especially strong for the British Empire, the histories of North and South America, as well as regional and local history. We also endeavour to coordinate acquisitions with other libraries around Bloomsbury. For example, we wouldn't normally acquire material on ancient history because we know our library colleagues at the Institute of Classical Studies, or for example, UCL's Institute of Archaeology would have acquired those titles probably already. Right, to help explore our collections, readers can find many collection guides on our website, while some describe actual collections you can physically visit. For example, if you go to the second floor of the Institute, you can stand amongst our Italian or Low Countries collections. Other guides are thematic, giving an overview of all our collections from the perspective of a particular subject. For example, we have guides on medical history, the First World War, as well as shown here, environmental history. If you decide to explore this guide, you'll see it's divided into several sections. At the top, there's a guidance on searching and getting further help, followed by a large section showcasing some of the published primary sources you can find in the library, as well as published diaries and letter collections. You can find listed relevant travel accounts, for example, works about specific environments, as well as a range of works on environmental and ecological thought, from the 19th and 20th century works of George P. Marsh and John Muir, continuing on to works by Rachel Carson and Bill McKibben, through to more recent works by Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion as well. After this section, there is a smaller section on the secondary works that you can find in the library, including bibliographies, reference works, and works on the historiography of environmental history. The last section in this guide includes several case studies. They showcase how relevant information can be sometimes hidden but extracted from a variety of different sources. So, for example, in the case study on disappearing locks, for example, some of the maps you can find in our collections have been used to chart the shrinkage and disappearance of the Norlock in Edinburgh and Loch Spinney in Moray. In another one of the case studies as well, on Theodore Roosevelt's forestry policy, relevant material can be found in the collection of published letters one can find in our US collections, as well as the Institute's run of the journals of the House of Representatives and the Senate as well. Another case study I hope to add to this guide, and the focus of the rest of this discussion today, is the 1927 flood of the Mississippi River. I'd read about the flood mainly through works of fiction. However, while reading a modern anthology of I.W. Wells's writings on an anti-lynching campaign, I stumbled upon a section of her journalism she specifically wrote on African Americans' experiences of the flood in the deep south of the 1920s. I became curious to know what other material may about this event may be hidden within the IHR Library's collection. So what follows is a description of a finding exercise I did, highlighting works from the IHR collections as well as a selection of online works too. This is very much my own approach to finding sources, and usually, as a first step, this may sound obvious, I check for the obvious. Although looking through the library's US History Collection Guide didn't yield any obvious leads, I then checked the catalogue and discovered the library does actually have one work specifically on the flood, published in the same year, 1927. So shown here is Lars Saxon's Father Mississippi. The work comprises of a history of the Mississippi, followed by a section describing the events of the flood, accompanied by photographs and testimonies, highlighting both the experiences of those affected and how the authorities reacted to the disaster. Unfortunately, no other work specifically about the flood currently appears in our collections that I could find. However, as has already been hinted, relevant information can be buried within other sources, seemingly unrelated sources as well. These I have defined as broad and narrow. I tend to regard narrow sources as work specifically about an event. As already mentioned, I will showcase some online catalogues later that would help researchers identify works such as these. The other category I call broad sources. These are usually works that contain within them a multitude of subjects, such as letter collections, newspapers, government papers, even memoirs and autobiographies. So, considering government records first, the IHR has a run of the journals of both the Houses of Representatives and the Senate, which I have used in one of the case studies already mentioned about Roosevelt's forestry policy. However, to my slight annoyance, our run ends in 1925. So this sparked me off to wander off into the internet to find relevant material, while simultaneously being reminded that it's unlikely that just one library or archive will have everything one might need. So listed here are links to the digitized versions of both the federal government papers and a portal created by the Library of Congress, listing versions of state legislature proceedings, digitized mainly by the Hathi Trust. Looking through this resource, I discovered the coverage was not entirely uniform, unfortunately. While records from 1927 exist for the states of Arkansas and Tennessee, the versions listed here for Mississippi and Louisiana go up to 1920 and 1922 respectively. Although increasing amounts of material are being digitized, it did remind me again that this is still an ongoing process and large bodies of information still exclusively remain in print. Another major broad source containing a multitude of subjects are newspapers. Again, increasingly newspapers are being digitized, and conducting a search for the Mississippi flood for the years 1927 to 28 in the freely accessible resource Chronicling America thankfully yielded almost about 3,000 hits. And given the scale of the flood, unsurprisingly, mention was also made in the international press. In the Times Digital Archive, for example, 86 articles about the flood were published in 1927 alone. So, while many of the government records and newspaper resources were found via internet searches, I found that specialist bibliographies, either printed or online, are invaluable to yielding more information, reflecting what my colleague Argler has already said. Shown here is the link to the Environmental History Bibliography database, which I found quite useful. Also in the notes to Susan Scott Parrish's monograph, The Flood Year of 1927, I discovered relevant printed source material in works that may not have appeared in an online search if you did, say, environmental history or floods. For example, here shows a small chapter from an anthology of transcripts of radio broadcasts made in the late 1920s and early 1940s by Walter Benjamin, currently shelved in the library's German collection. I've also found bibliographies and notes like these useful in pointing me to relevant archive collections too, which is quite useful. References from endnotes and bibliographies similarly pointed me in the direction of several other potential sources. I'm just showing here the interface for the IHR catalogue, very similar to the interface to the classics catalogue, which I use to find news resources. As you can see, it's quite standard. Keyword searches are default, with the option to do, among other things, author title and subject heading searches, which has been mentioned already in some of the presentations. Readers can also widen their search to include not only items from within the IHR Library, but also other libraries within the School of Advanced Studies, which the Institute of Classical Studies is part of, as well as Senate House Library. So, thanks to various bibliographic references I collected, this led me to several individuals whose works I wanted to check for relevant information about the Mississippi flood. Luckily, the IHR Library has a large collections of published diaries, memoirs, and letters, so I was confident I would find additional material. So, shown here are some of the relevant titles, such as W.E.B. Du Bois's published letters, the memoir of Herbert Hoover, who coordinated much of the flood response, the autobiography of Huey Long, who became governor of Louisiana while authorities were still dealing with the effects of the flood in 1928, and an anthology of the writings of Gifford Pinchot. With this last example, bibliographic references were again crucial. I knew he was active in the forestry policy and the establishment of the US national parks during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, but was unaware that he had written about the flood 2 decades later, until a reference in the Environmental History Bibliography database pointed me in the direction of the relevant chapter in his selected writings. Also, I just wanted to mention some of the possible comparative sources in the library's collections as well. One can find published letters and diaries about the Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s, for example. When published, we also have been collecting titles on Hurricane Katrina as well, included published oral history interviews, anthologies of news articles, and the way this disaster has been portrayed in popular media. Before I finish up, I just wanted to let you know about 2 other resources I found useful and use quite often. These are WorldCat and Library Hub Discover. Both of these allow a user to search hundreds of library catalogues at once. Library Hub Discover, I think, focuses on the UK and Ireland, while WorldCat, as the name might suggest, has a global reach. Similarly, for archive material held in the UK, the catalogue of the National Archives website covers the holdings of, I think, about 2,500 other archives other than itself. So, to summarise, my own personal approach to finding relevant information has been split into the broad and narrow source category I mentioned earlier. I approach the broad sources such as newspapers and government records searching for relevant information, or as I say, fishing for relevant information. I also identified through the use of library catalogues as well as printed and online bibliographies, further printed and archived material, what I consider what I call hunting for material. So hopefully this brief talk might be useful for you to extract relevant information in seemingly unrelated sources. So lastly, I just wanted to show here details about how you can join the IHR Library. Thankfully, membership is free to everyone, as well as some details about how you can contact us if you have any follow-up questions as well. So right now, I'm going to stop sharing, and I will pass you on to my colleague, John Levin, who will talk to you about the excellent online resource, British History Online. There we go.
Right, can you hear me? And can you see my slides?
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent. Right, good afternoon. I'm John Levin. I'm the editor of British History Online. British History Online is a non-profit digital archive run under the auspices of the Institute of Historical Research at Senate House, part of the University of London School of Advanced Study. Okay. It holds circa 1,300 volumes, of which about 200 are behind a paywall. It concentrates on the British Isles, but has materials relating to diplomatic relations with Europe and material relating to British colonial and imperial history. The fundamental strength of it is, and the difference between it and the likes of Google Books and the Internet Archive, is that its content is all fully and accurately transcribed into text. It is not just page images. This allows for accurate and reliable and trustworthy search. It ranges from medieval to 20th century. It's very strong on 17th century political coverage, and it covers all of the British Isles, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, as well as England. So what specifically environmental history do we have? First of all, we have a lot of histories of place. Chief amongst those are the Victoria County histories. The VCH project, founded in 1899, aims to produce deep, authoritative and multi-volume histories of every county in England, covering the earliest archaeological traces up to the present day. This map shows its extent. Aside from Durham, every county has a presence in the Victoria County histories. It's an ongoing project. I don't know if it'll ever finish, but as you can see, there are many active counties and even some counties that have complete histories. The first volume of every series, every county series, covers the natural history of the area, geology, the flora and fauna, and there are more focused descriptions of these and the agricultural situation to be found in the individual parish sections, along with histories of the changing environments as enclosures, urban development and industrial development took place. VCH being such a long-running endeavour, the focus and comprehension has changed over time. The later volumes have a wider view of what constitutes a history, with more social and more environmental history made more explicit. We also have many historic county histories covering Suffolk, Nottinghamshire, Kent and Suffolk, 4 volumes of the Magna Britannica, and 3 historic topographical dictionaries from the 1840s covering England, Scotland and Wales. All these have, to a greater or lesser extent, some description of the nature and environment of the counties. None of these are what we might consider environmental history today. They are more topographical and less critical or investigative. They are, however, a record, however mediated, of the environment, and also an embodiment of the attitudes towards the environment at the time these works were written. We also have a fine collection of materials on London, including 60 volumes of the ongoing Survey of London project, as well as historic chronicles such as Stowe's Survey and Norfolk's New History of London. Cities are undeniably an environmental phenomenon in themselves. They are on land and on rivers. They have their own microclimates and have their own bird and animal life. And as a concentration of people and buildings, urban society makes great demands and alters the environment of their immediate surrounding areas and far, far beyond as well. Here again, there is little explicit environmental history in the modern sense, but relations between humans and nature invariably come up, such as this rather interesting description from Norfolk's History of London of the Thames round London Bridge. The passage under the arches was contracted by enormous platforms built around the decaying piers called Stirlings, which dammed up the water so much that at the return of the tide, the river above the bridge is nearly 5 feet higher than it is below, so that during the ebb, the water through every arch formed so many cataracts, pouring down with a tremendous roar and whirling round on the lower side in foaming eddies as soon as disengaged from the confinement. Taking a brief break from textual sources, BHO also has a collection of maps, mainly of London, including the Agus map of the previous slide, but also 2 comprehensive sets of late 19th century Ordnance Survey maps covering all of Britain. Although BHO offers little more than being able to view these maps, it's worth noting that map reading technology is advancing rapidly, even for pre-modern non-standard cartographies. And I expect this to be a very important source for environmental history and other histories in the future. BHO has a very large collection of state-produced texts of political history, especially for the 17th century. It includes statutes, journals of the Houses of Lords and Commons, parliamentary diaries, calendars of close rolls and patent rolls from medieval times, calendars of state papers from the early modern up to the 18th century, and calendars of treasury books. These are state-produced texts in two senses. Firstly, it's the material of government, material paper that was used in the everyday procedures. And secondly, in the case of the calendars, it is catalogues and digests of this material, first produced in the 19th century when the government reorganized its archives, created the Public Record Office, and acknowledged a certain right of public access to its records. Sometimes they're fragmented minutiae, sometimes, as with the statutes, tortuously written, sometimes bombastic or formulaic or dissimulating, as in much of the parliamentary debates. And it is the work of a small number of privileged men, and none of it can be taken at face value. But this paperwork does register an outside. It responds to concerns raised by other groups. It uses legislation and policy to enforce its will, to rectify a situation, or mollify an opposition in response to these concerns. For example, the journals of the Houses of Parliament have, on I'd say a weekly basis at least, petitions from various groups of citizens, whether merchants demanding free trade to India, wool workers to the contrary supporting the East India Company on whom they depend, debtors praying for release from prison, and commoners in Flintshire defending their right to Saltney Marsh, the inhabitants of Worrell in Cheshire protesting the same bill of 1697 to improve the navigation of the River Dee. So these state papers are much wider and deeper than one might presume. The problem is finding the questions to ask of them and how to pose them. Whilst researching this talk, I was struck about how little discussion there is of using textual sources for environmental history. Donald Hughes, in his book, What is Environmental History, gives just half a paragraph to this. Peter Frankopan, mentioned earlier, contrasts the every now and again of discovering a new text by chance with a superabundance of what he calls the climate archives, data collected from tree rings, ice cores, calcium carbonate deposits. Now, these are obviously important historical data sets, but they are neither complete, sufficient in themselves, or so transparent that interpretation springs forth from them, and there is no reason to neglect these other textual sources. And sources are always being continually rediscovered through the historical practice of asking questions and asking new questions. Single documents and whole archives can be reinterpreted through the telescopes and the microscopes of, for example, women's history, indigenous history, and environmental history. And beyond the necessity of reading these sources and reinterpreting them, what is new today and what BHO is part of is the superabundance through digital reproduction of historical sources. There's now more historical material within reach and more than can be read than ever before. And this material is itself transformed, although our material fundamentally comes from books. They are digitized, they are quantitatively and qualitatively changed to become more discoverable, searchable, and manipulable. Searching in this context can be considered a way of asking questions with a bonus of minimal latency. You can ask a question very quickly and get, if not an accurate answer, an interesting answer. Or possibly not even answers, but more prompts for further questions and prompts for thought. As an example of this, let's take the Statutes of the Realm. This is the canonical collection of the laws of England, and we have 3 volumes online covering 1625 to 1701. This is excluding the acts of the interregnum, which ostensibly are purged from the record, but we have those online as well. Let's start with a really general question. Were rivers an object for the statutes? And searching on river gives 94 results, 94 pieces of legislation. Searching on individual volumes and bearing in mind that the first of the 3 we have covers 35 years, the others just 10 and 7, give 34, 22 and 38 acts for each. So already there's a pattern emerging. There's more acts about rivers as the century progresses. A quick look shows that many of these acts are to do with making rivers navigable. What does this mean for marine life? A Boolean search for river and fish gives 45 results. And reading the results shows concern both for the rights to fish in rivers and to preserve and nourish stocks of fish. And one of these acts, which is the top on the screen, is the act that the commoners and the gentlemen were protesting against, about making the River Dee navigable. And it seems some provision for fishing rights has been made and the petitions were heard and considered. And further searching, further reiteration could go into these results, separating fully fledged acts from amending legislation, analysing the places on the rivers, analysing where the rivers themselves are. Was there more legislation related to the rivers feeding into the Thames or in the north of England, for example, and so on. So that's British History Online, its content and how one can ask something of what it holds and some ways of asking questions of it. You can find us online at britishhistory.ac.uk. There is a small section, as I said, behind a paywall. You can access this for free in the Vol Library at the Institute of Historical Research. If you have any questions, you can drop me a line at british-history@sasac.uk, and we're on Twitter as well. Thank you for your time. And now I will pass over to my colleague, Jenny Lakes, who will be talking about the bibliography of British and Irish history. If I can just get rid of this. I'm sorry, this is... Right,
Thanks, John. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much, John, for the introduction. So my name is Jenny Lelkashwa-Vogel, and I'm going to be speaking about how you can use the bibliography to research environmental histories. So a little bit about the bibliography. It's a curated list of secondary sources that has been written about British, Irish and Imperial and Commonwealth history, but it also includes Britain and Ireland's relations with other countries, whether that be diplomatic histories or kind of trade relationships. It was established in 1909 and is a kind of research project between the Royal Historical Society, the Institute for Historical Research, and now Brepols, the publisher. And it contains over 640,000 references that cover 55 BCE until the present day. And if you're researching Irish history, Irish environmental histories, I highly recommend using Irish History Online in conjunction with the bibliography so that you don't miss any important information. So despite being called the bibliography of British and Irish history, material covering the rest of the world makes up a really significant portion of what the bibliography holds. And so it will also include information about environmental history within those areas. So as an example of the global reach of BBIH, this map shown here shows the coverage excluding the British Isles. As you can see, the bibliography is particularly strong on former British colonies and Commonwealth countries, but also as well as Britain and Ireland's kind of immediate neighbours in mainland Europe. So the bibliography is updated 3 times a year and contains detailed information about books, journal articles and reviews, book chapters, and some history PhD thesis. So if you're beginning at the very beginning of your research, one area that you might want to have a look at is the subject analyzer tool, which you can find within the author and journal tabs. By using this, it allows you to find BBIH's top 50 authors, book series and journal titles on any BBIH subject, whether that be by kind of subject term or people as subject or places. So it's kind of a quite a good place to kind of start at the very beginning of your research. And so to find out kind of everything that the bibliography holds on your research topic, I'd recommend using the advanced search, as you can see here, because it allows you to conduct bibliographical and subject searches at the same time. Importantly for historical research, the BBIH's subject tree is unique and has been developed with historians in mind. And you can also search by the period covered. So you can be as broad or as narrow as you want, depending on the time period that you're researching. So when conducting subject searching in the advanced search, a good place to start is the subject tree. So you can either search it by typing a keyword into the search box at the top of the screen, or by exploring the different levels within the subject tree. So the very first column on the left-hand side of the screen here, will show the top level of the subject tree, with the other columns showing narrow terms as you open up further levels and move through the tree. So in terms of researching environmental history, the first and I guess the most obvious place to start would be within the demographic and environmental history section, as you can see here. However, if your research includes researching people's attitudes to the environment, whether that be nature, animals, or relating to kind of conservation or environmental policy, you'll find that information within the intellectual, cultural, and artistic history section, as seen here. You'll also find relevant information within the sources level, especially if your research involves using different types of documents or records. So that could be ranging from official records, travelers' descriptions, autobiographical materials or correspondences. And as my colleagues have also touched upon, increasingly that would also include oral histories, photographs, and maps and plans. So these examples are by no means exhaustive, and so what I would recommend doing is exploring the different levels of BBIH's subject tree so that you can build tailored searches that are and find relevant information for your particular research interests. Within the advanced search, you can also search by geographical location within the place names tree. Again, you can search by either typing keywords into the search box at the top of the screen, or by navigating the different levels the same way as you explored the subject tree. To help you get the most out of using the place names tree, I recommend having a look at the Gazetteer of British Place Names, just so that you're making sure that you're using kind of similar terminology in terms of the place or places that you're researching within the British Isles. And for more information about searching the bibliography as well as how it's compiled, I highly recommend watching these online tutorial videos, which can be found on the link on this page here, which will be circulated at the end of today's event. Once you've kind of done a search within the bibliography, this is an example of what a record looks like. This is an example for a book, and each record, depending on the type of material that you're looking at or wanting to look at, is organized in a very similar way. So you'll find bibliographical information at the top. So that would be kind of author, title, publication information. In the middle, you'll have the subject information, so that will include the kind of subject keywords, as well as places and the period covered, and also any people who the work is about will be in there as well. And at the bottom of book records, as Sue has already kind of talked about, you can also find book reviews, and these are especially helpful for if you're doing kind of a historical analysis of the subject that you're researching. So any text in green within the bibliography is a link to a new search within the bibliography. And so this is really helpful for you in terms of finding out what else the bibliography might hold on a particular subject area that you're interested in finding more about. So in this example, if we selected on woodlands, this would open up a new search within the bibliography. And as you can see, there are over 500 references specifically about woodlands. And this example is an example of a journal article. And as you can see, it's structured in a very similar way in terms of where you will find the bibliographical and subject information. But at the bottom, you can see the links to the full text, whether that be through the DOI or the journal homepage. And in some other records, you might also find links to online databases such as JSTOR or Project Muse. One thing to notice is that specifically if you're researching particular people and they come up within a record, there may also be links to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography and the UK National Archives catalogue, which are in the red text within the kind of purple circle you can see on the screen. By clicking on those red text, you'll be taken through to these resources. And I've included this because it's often worthwhile exploring the links within the bibliography, because they're often overlooked and they can be really helpful for you in terms of extending your research. And finally, this is an example of an edited book. One thing to note about the bibliography is that it calls book chapters articles in a book. So just remember that when you're using the advanced search. And as you can see in this record, it lists all the individually authored chapters that are relevant to the bibliography. And by clicking on one of them, you will open up that particular book chapter in a new page. So once you've found relevant resources for your research, you can navigate from BBIH to different library catalogues. If you're affiliated with an academic institution that has a subscription to BBIH, make sure that you're logged into the bibliography through your institutional library account, as this will speed up the process in terms of accessing full text if your library has a subscription or has print availability to a particular work. So you can also access the bibliography on site in the IHR Library, and you can do this via either the IHR Library catalogue or the online resources page on the website. One thing to note though is that you do need to be on site and in the building, and you can access it either through the IHR Library computers or when you're connected to the University of London Wi-Fi on your own device. Offsite access via the IHR is restricted due to licensing restrictions, unfortunately. So the best way to access it offsite would be through your own institution if your institution has a subscription. So in terms of gaining access to a particular material or finding a print copy, there are a number of different options, and you'll find these at the top of the record. So firstly, you can search by your institution's library, which will appear as different logos, as you can see here. By clicking on the logo, you'll be taken through to your library catalogue, where you will find information about the print availability or online access. Alternatively, you can search by Google Books, where you can then navigate to WorldCat through Google Books, and you can follow the different options depending on which view of Google Books that you're using. So this is particularly helpful if you or your research is not based in the UK or Ireland, or if you want to request something through document supply or interlibrary loan. And as my colleague Mike had already mentioned, JISC Library Hub Discover is another useful resource to be using. And again, you can access it from a BBIH record by clicking on the Library Discover button. And so Library Hub Discover will search the collections of over 180 academic, national and specialist libraries in the UK, and again is another useful resource to be using. So in terms of, you can also use the bibliography not only to find relevant information, you can also use it to keep up to date with the latest published research in your field, as well as managing your reference list and bibliographies by exporting references. To help you do this, our publisher Brepols have produced a number of tutorial videos, which can be found on the links on this slide here. So as I mentioned, BBIH has an email alert service, which is really easy to set up. The email alert service allows you to save your searches and notifies you when a BBIH update contains new records that match your saved searches. So this could be potentially up to 3 times a year. So when you receive the email, you would just click on the links within that email, and then it would bring up the new records that have been added as part of that update, and it flags it with a kind of a red new square kind of next to each of the resources. And you can also use the bibliography to quickly compile your own bibliographies or to add footnotes to your academic work. Simply just click on this record tool and then just copy and paste the citation that you need. And you can also export references to reference management software such as RefWorks, Zotero, and EndNote. And this will save you time in terms of compiling reading lists, bibliographies, and footnotes for your academic work. So there are different ways you can do this. So the first one is that you just simply select export, and then you can choose different options in a screen that comes up. Or if you're more familiar with using Zotero and you have the plugin installed, you can click on the yellow folder, and then you can then save the references from the search screen or the particular record, and then you can then use that then for your research. And the bibliography also regularly produces themed reading lists on a wide variety of different topics. These two here on environmental history and infectious diseases are the most relevant for this session. And they each contain around 500 references to recently published materials that are freely available in terms of these reading lists are freely available for you to access. And finally, you can keep up to date with the bibliography by reading the IHR's blog, and also we're very active on the IHR's Twitter. And if you'd like to contact the bibliography, our contact details can be found on the IHR's website here. So I hope you found this talk helpful in terms of introducing the bibliography, and that what we'll do now is start the Q&A. So I'll just stop sharing. So in terms of questions that we have, if you have any, then you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your kind of electronic hand. From the chat already, we did have a question that was around slides being available sent to participants after the event, and they will be. So each of the slides and the recording will be available, will be sent around after, and they'll be also made available on the IHR's events archive page as well for people to access anytime that they'd like. So whilst we wait for if anyone has any questions, I did have a question for the panel, which was around thinking about one of the key themes that has come out from the presentations was about identifying keywords and subjects. And it would be, I guess, quite helpful for, I guess, everyone on the panel to have a chat, I guess, talk about what tips and tricks, I guess, would be in terms of identifying appropriate keywords and the most relevant keywords.
Shall I go first on this?
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I think what I generally do when you've got a large body of text is just, it's simple to put a word in a search box. There's very little latency. You get instant results. You just chuck in whatever you think. One problem with words like environment is that you will get a lot of results, or nature even more so. If you start searching on specific animals that you're interested in, you might get fewer but perhaps more relevant. I know it's difficult, it's very different if you're looking at library records, but when you've got full text, it's just quick and simple to throw anything in and just take a look at the results, and the chances are one word will lead to another, and there'll be snippets of text that will suggest other things.
Thanks, John. In terms of the bibliography, one of the things is that, as I mentioned in my talk, is that the subject tree has been created specifically with, it's a kind of unique and specifically with historians in mind. But often Library of Congress subject headings will be mapped onto the BBIH's subject tree. So it's often worth kind of, if you find anything within library catalogues or other like archive catalogues, it's often worth putting them in so that you can you see what might come up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate something that I think it was Argla mentioned before, and I think Sue touched upon before. Obviously, with library records, overwhelmingly, you'll be in a library that uses the Library of Congress subject headings. Although, if you go to a medical library or a library of medical history, such as the Wellcome, they'll probably use National Library of Medicine subject headings as well. But as I say, the subject headings, as mentioned before, are usually hyperlinked, so you can kind of explore the different subjects and different items that fall under those subject headings. So,
thank you. Gary Willis, I can see that you had have a comment and your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to endorse the comment that had been made earlier about thinking creatively about what might be productive sources of material. I'll just give one brief example. My thesis, which I'm writing, is on the impact on the British landscape of Britain's Second World War military industrial sites. And I was very keen to find out the actual physical size of the sites. I didn't find it anywhere in the predictable sources like Ministry of Agriculture records in terms of loss of land or anything, but I found it in Board of Trade weekly journals, a more or less complete stock of which is kept in the Senate House Library, a more complete stock than what the British Library has got. So, you know, it was from an economic source about an environmental issue.
Great, thank you. We have also had a question from in the chat, which is asking about asking the panel to reflect on how your collecting might be changing given interest in environmental histories. Are we looking at our collections differently?
well, from from the IHR's point of view, obviously to repeat what Argler and my colleagues at Classics have said, there isn't a standalone environmental history collection yet, although at the IHR we are quite keen. One of the areas that we're quite keen on is collecting works on methodology and historiography, and I'm very keen to collect any works on any aspect of that sort of history. So you will find increasing works on how to do environmental history, or how to, if there's, say, a work published on conducting oral history research in an environmental setting, I would probably jump at that sort of work and everything. Me personally, I am trying to widen out our collection, as long as it obviously falls within the IHR's remit of generally collecting published primary sources. So I don't know what you think, Argler, at all.
1 second. Here we go. Sorry, I just couldn't unmute myself for my apologies. But yeah, I think so at St. House Library, we're taking a very similar approach at looking more carefully at how much more we can collect in this area, because it is a current area of big interest, and I have personally been buying quite a lot of environmental history titles in the last few years. But interestingly enough, one thing to maybe mention, which is something we discussed a little bit before the session started, environmental history is actually quite an old field of research in the historical profession too, and often, like with many of these research trends, it kind of comes in waves. So while there's a lot being written on environmental history now, and a lot of the work is updating the previous scholarship and is really great, there's quite a lot that you can also find from previous times in which environmental history was an important research field. So for example, I think in the 1970s, environmental history, especially British environmental history, had quite a big up curve. So while we're definitely developing our collections very actively in that field of research now, I think you might also be surprised of how much is already there, and that's kind of what we brought out in a lot of our talks today. We have so much that is already relevant in our collections. It just takes slightly different approaches to get there, as Gary's example showed, for example, too. There's a lot that you can discover that's already there.
I wonder if Paul or Sue had anything in terms of to add in terms of your library collections.
Well, I think it's as previous people have said, we collect. we fortunately have a quite narrow field in which we collect the classics, and because there's more material being published, we're going to be acquiring it. But also, to pick up what Argula said, I regret that I missed one of my favourite people out when I in one of the slides in the talk. Goes back to before the First World War. A chap called I think it's W.H.S. Jones, known as Malaria Jones, because his obsession was that malaria was a great influence in classical history, especially in the fall of Rome. So these things have always been there. We're becoming more aware of them, and as they come out, we are collecting them.
And I think that's also true for the bibliography, and would be for British History Online as well, in terms of kind of reviewing what is already there and reviewing new titles that are relevant, and adding those to the collections where relevant. And also, one of the things in terms of for the work with the bibliography is that a lot of a kind of growing area that I've seen is a kind of around Indigenous histories, talking about environmental histories as well. So kind of making sure that is captured for the time periods that for the work I do with the bibliography, in terms of capturing that within new books, new journal articles, and making sure that they're captured as well. So we are just a couple of minutes over past, so I'll just double check to see if we have anything else in the chat, but we don't. So thank you everyone for attending, and as we said earlier, the recordings and the presentations for this session will be made available over the next couple of days. So thank you very much.